If you look at the different symptoms when, for example, you have a heart attack, so I think everyone, quote unquote, knows what heart attack symptoms are. However, the symptoms that we are being told, both as a population as well as what medical doctors are actually taught in school, they're based on the male body. So the fact that there often is, not only can be, but often is a variation in symptoms. So not just severity, but actually completely different symptoms for female heart attack patients. So they go into hospital, the tests are being run while you haven't had a heart attack. You don't have anything, just go home. That is very dangerous. Welcome back to Biohacking Eve, Health Optimization for Women with Judith Mueller, where we shine a light on everything that will help you reach your best self as a woman, as unique and individual as only you can be. Live long and prosper, my friend. Hello, welcome back, everyone. Today we have Susan Stover on the show. Susan is a marketing and sales specialist in the FemTech industry and sits on the advisory boards of FemTech Canada and FemTech India, while also serving on the steering committee for the Innovation Equity Forum from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Susan is also director of marketing and sales at High Ivy Health, which is a medical device company that has created the first remote therapeutic and monitoring device for patients with pelvic floor dysfunction causing chronic pelvic pain. So, Susan, clearly you're very versed in the femtech industry, which has also led you to found the FemTech book together with Karen Wells, I believe. And this has been running for 4 years now. And I'm actually very happy to have you join us on a quarterly basis going forward to present your findings. However, today we're actually going to do a deep dive on the femtech market. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Judith.
Fantastic. So, Susan, tell us, if women are actually living longer than men, why on earth do we need femtech?
What a great question. I think we could probably chat about it all day. I think one of the core sort of impetus to have something called femtech, like the femtech industry, for those who haven't heard about it, there's different definitions floating out there, but I think the best one was put forth by Brittany Barreto. And what she put out there is that femtech is services, products, and software to help for conditions that differently, disproportionately, and solely affect women. So this moniker was coined by Ida Tin, I believe, in 2014. So it's a fairly new term. And she was as many people in the femtech industry will know, was the CEO of Clue, which was one of the first menstrual trackers on the market. So when we think about women's health is not a new idea. It's not a new issue. And where I feel like femtech stepped in was creating a sense of urgency, as well as bringing together a host of entrepreneurs, organizations, investors, clinicians to rally under the urgency that there is around innovation in women's health. As you mentioned, women are living longer, but they're often living longer in poor health and disability. So when we think about the quality of health and the quality of life, there are several reasons, and I'm happy to unpack each one going back historically. But I think the biggest thing to underline when people are like, why would you call it femtech? Why wouldn't you just call it women's health? Or why wouldn't you just call it health? That's part of the core reason why that was came out of the woodwork.
And I think it's super interesting when you look at the statistics. There was a recent McKinsey report that I believe said women spend 25% more of their life in poor health. So again, it's the mortality versus the morbidity aspect. Super. I think this also comes back in part due to a data gap. So the whole gender data gap. So why aren't there more women in clinical trials?
I think one thing to just underline real quick before I go into that question is the definition of women, I think, is something to underline there. I think that when we think of women, we can often go into our more cisgendered sort of presentation of women. But I just want to underline here that people with vaginas, people without vaginas, there's all different kinds of definitions. Some people are non-binary, but the term women's health, I think, helps us guide that conversation. And I think it's just important to say off the top. So when we go into, and then also when we think about women, excuse me, I think we also want to make sure that we're not considering women as a homogeneous group. I think that often when we think of the most advancements when it comes to women's health, again, we're thinking of white cis women. I think we need to really parse out these things. We need to think about not just physical presentation, but also economic, geographic, all of those different intersectionalities that are so critical to understanding. So when we go back into the history of clinical trials, for the most part, when we think about medicine and how it's dominated by men, we do have to position ourselves very much in the Western world. So the Western world is definitely a big force. And then you combining imperialism and white supremacy and all of that. That's really what we've understood for women's health kind of coming in. So clinical trials, the history of clinical trials is very interesting because it wasn't quite formalized until the turn of the 20th century when we started to see organizations like the FDA start to regulate certain substances, particularly pharmaceuticals. And that's when clinical trials, not just to confirm efficacy, but also safety, came into the fore. So when we had pharmaceutical companies or even individual clinicians, we started looking at ethics, we started looking at all those different standards of how we test out these things. Women were disproportionately involved in clinical trials when they first started because going back to the Greeks, even thinking about that, it's almost like this impossible ideal of the male body that has been seen as the standard that every other body should be measured to, and not just the male body, but like a white European male body that was seen as, again, like even going through Darwin, and then we got Freud, and then we got all of these different ideas about like us as a species. You go through, eugenics movements, all of that, and women were caught in the net of that. Of Charles Darwin even said that women were an inferior part of the human species. So a lot of the medicine that was done early on wasn't done ethically using women's bodies. It wasn't seen as important. But then in the 1950s, we saw a drug called thalidomide come onto the market. So thalidomide was prescribed to expectant parents, specifically pregnant women, to help them with morning sickness. So that's like nausea, all of that. And what we saw was some really horrific birth defects in the fetuses that they carried. So particularly like mental, but also physical. We saw deformed or underformed limbs. And at that point, instead of looking at the sort of approach to how we prescribe medication on whole, the very paternalistic, and I would say quite well-meaning response to this was to say that no women of childbearing age were allowed in any clinical trials to avoid any sort of birth defects on the fetus. And we can see very much that idea of women's bodies not being as important as the progeny they incubate is very much alive, especially in the Western world. But what this did essentially was create almost an excuse to leave women out of studies. And not just that, but again, I won't go into too many book recommendations, but in Maya Dusenberry's Doing Harm, they outline how mice models are often used as a preliminary test for a lot of medical technology. And often researchers would refuse to use female mice because of their pesky hormones or like what we didn't understand. So it wasn't even just this, let's keep women safe if they could potentially have children, but also women's bodies were seen as too complex. So it wasn't until the 1990s in the US and Canada, at least, that women were allowed into clinical trials. And it really hasn't been until either last decade or the early of this decade that different countries like Australia or the UK are actually mandating that there needs to be equal representation. So when we think about femtech, when we think about specifically about medicine, think about that as a gender gap, where not only are we looking at this in human models, but in animal models as well. And there's just so much that we need to catch up on.
I think there's a couple of things on that as well. So I think one is the paternalistic approach, which you mentioned, which I think is really interesting. You also have the cost aspect. So if you were to say you've got 100 men in the trial, and all of a sudden so you've got cost you 100 million, whatever it's going to be, just making up some figures here. And all of a sudden you're saying we're going to include the equivalent group of women. Because we've got 4 different cycle phases, you actually need a control for each and every single week of the cycle. So you're not just doubling the numbers because you're doubling up for women, but you actually need to quintuple because you've got 4 times the cost for women on top of that, which I think is very prohibitive. I think the upside or the sort of silver lining I'm seeing with AI being used more and more in drug discovery, I think as we have more data, as we learn more about our bodies and how they function, we can actually cut a lot of costs by making drug discovery more efficient, more effective. So you can actually screen for efficacy in silico, as it were. So in silico basically means on a computer versus in vitro, which is in the petri dish, and in vivo, which is then in the human. So you're starting stage 0 basically and make that more effective. The other thing I found really interesting, there was another statistics regarding cancer, for example, and I can't remember the exact years, but I think this was the last 5 to 10 years. About 83% of cancer study patients were male, and this included all female cancers. So that means either you didn't have a very good distribution of these studies still, again, as you said, depending where they were carried out, and or we're just not carrying out that many studies on all female cancers, and or we don't have that many assets in the pipeline. So in plain English, that means pharma is not developing as much for female cancers. Again, I don't know where the numbers are exactly or what the reason for the skew is exactly, but all of these are potential factors. And finally, you might know the numbers better than I do, but do you remember the scandal around digoxin? There was a heart problem drug, basically, which was supposed to, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that if you remember the facts better.
I don't know as much about digoxin. I know that there's
Right.
medications like, I know that Ambien, there was a huge issue with that and actually a lawsuit because the ways in which, like you mentioned, like with the different cancer patients, what a lot of the medical institutions and big pharma, basically the formula they had was, okay, we'll take males' bodies and we'll minus 60 pounds. So that in the way that they were basically saying women are just tiny men, where there weren't a lot of other considerations. So when it came to sleeping medications like Ambien, there were car accidents and a lot of fatalities based on this formula because the ways in which women digest and metabolize these drugs is like completely different.
And again, this is super individualized, not just between men and women, but as you said previously, even in other groups, we have to think about genetics, for example, because if you've got a certain skin color or a certain ethnicity or other things, you have a certain genetic heritage that actually means that there's certain drugs that are metabolized more or less, so basically faster or slower for you. So dosage is actually something that we're learning in medicine in general. Dosage is very individual these days. Coming back to digoxin, so basically this was a drug that was prescribed for heart patients. I can't remember if it was, I don't think it was stroke, but it was another heart issue. And I think it came out in the 50s or 60s. It was the standard of care. So basically what you would be prescribed if you had this problem as a matter of fact, or as a matter of, well, standard really, for a couple of decades. And it was in the early 2000s that anecdotal evidence was so overwhelming that this is actually not a safe drug for women. And that's when people finally started doing clinical trials with digoxin. I think in some countries it is still the standard of care. I think in other countries it has been taken off the market. But I mean, case in point, FemTech is just one application. But if you look at the different symptoms, when, for example, you have a heart attack, so I think everyone, quote unquote, knows what heart attack symptoms are. However, the symptoms that we are being told, both as a population as well as what medical doctors are actually taught in school, they're based on the male body. So the fact that there often is, not only can be, but often is a variation in symptoms. So not just severity, but actually completely different symptoms for female heart attack patients. So they go into hospital, the tests are being run while you haven't had a heart attack, you don't have anything, just go home. That is very dangerous. But we'll come back to this in other topics. Do you want to dive a little bit more into the homogeneity, or rather lack thereof, for the group that we call women?
Well, I think, yeah, like it's so important. I think that's part of the reason why with the FemTech Book Club, we've focused on books that talk about specifically the scientific ground and different studies, but we've also looked at different books about feminism and fat phobia and racism and just the social aspects of how we look at women as a group. And I think it's very important for us to acknowledge those aspects. And because I think on the other side of the coin, when we think about the ideal body or the bodies that we're studying, that's disadvantaging a lot of folks as well. Like a white European male is going to have a very different history of health, a socioeconomic status than someone of color living in the deep south of the United States. It is just different. And when we talk about individualized care, I think that's something that we always need to consider. And I think a big part of that is really looking at the gender data gap through an intersectional lens. I think there are lots of different examples of where we've just been solving for thin white women, and that has been traditionally the market. I think anecdotally, I think one thing that us as the femtech market needs to think about, and I'm coming from a marketing perspective, is that I'm starting to get a bit alarmed by seeing some of the marketing that I have seen out there, particularly maybe in the menopause market or PCOS, these sort of hormonal conditions, that the ideal is a thin white woman. And what we're putting out there is that to not like visually, and I don't think it's a malicious intent. I think that these are things that we've just learned to emulate. I think these are things that are so entrenched in the way that we think about health. We think about health as like thin is good. And, the way that we have traditionally shown healthy, happy bodies, it's been the nuclear family, generally of white skin. So even just like here in Canada, like I'm very fortunate to live in Toronto, which is an extremely multicultural city. And the ways in which I would apply a women's health model would be completely different depending on where I am in the city. And then, of course, like in Canada, when we go up to the far north, it's a completely different demographic. And even socially, like when we think about bringing new solutions to different folks, I think we need to think about the history of the use and abuse of Black bodies in the United States. There's a very, I think, healthy and well-earned mistrust of the medical institutions by Black communities because they have in the past been either abused or misused and completely not seen at all. And I have seen a lot of really great femtech companies rooted in that thinking of the Earth app. So that's Drop the B for Bias, that actually helps expectant mothers connect with maternal health experts who are informed racially. Actually, they can talk to other people who've been through with a certain OBGYN, been through that experience and be able to rate them. And it's really based in that community of being able to share experiences, not this sort of top down like doctors know best. They'll tell you what it is. Not that I think all of these doctors are malicious. I think it's definitely the soil that they're grown into. I think is or like as recently as 2018, I think I saw a statistic where I think it was something like 60% of a graduating class of a medical school genuinely thought that Black people felt less pain. And I think when you layer on the sort of history of women's pain being ignored or maligned, that just leads to severely deadly consequences. So I think we often think of, at least in a narrative that I've seen about the United States, and again, I'm in Canada, but it's quite a dominant narrative that we live in some sort of post-racial world and that science is this impartial, completely clinical, just looking at the lab results. It's just not true. That's not how people are treated day to day. And I think it's important for us as femtech companies to take that under consideration, whether or not we're going through clinical trials, but also in our messaging, in who we decide to talk to, and where we decide to launch our products. All of that needs to be taken under consideration. And not to mention things like able bodiness, like I mentioned, women live in more disabilities, thinking about the accessibility of our products and also not always pushing towards that you need to always be able bodied because some people are just not able bodied. And we need to think about all of those things, which is not, it's not a small bite to take. But I think when we think about the gender data gap, there are other data gaps that exist, but they've closed it a little bit more. And we need to leverage that information and those communities.
So, as a founder, as a femtech founder, how would you find out about these different challenges, different markets? Because, for example, when you talk about the Black community and what's happened with bodies, again, having been raised in Europe, having spent most of my life here, I think there's a lot of things that I'm not aware of happening in the rest of the world and vice versa. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I think my advice to any femtech founder looking to create a solution, first of all, I would say that most femtech founders actually create solutions based on a personal experience. So that's definitely something that's already in their pocket, and they are able to exercise a great deal of empathy, right? Where they've experienced this, they understand what it is from their perspective. If you are any femtech founder, my advice, again, from more of a marketing perspective, is from a it's some advice I got from a great book called Brandsplaining: How Marketing is Still Sexist and What You Can Do to Fix It. So some of these just like key strategies is to think about the industry that you're in. So if you're in a femtech industry, what you're looking to do is to take the system as it exists and to create a whole new technology. You are at the forefront and the frontier of looking at a new way to solve this problem. So why not do that with your marketing as well? Why not, instead of like how many how so many other companies think, oh, I know about women's health and I'm just going to tell them you the pains in your head, this is fine, or they don't really understand the problem, or it's based on all of this old knowledge that's just not true. Do the same when it comes to your market. And I'm telling you, like, women will talk to you. They want to have their stories heard, and think about what your biases might be. So I see a lot of people talking about questionnaires or surveys, and some practical advice that I would give is always ask open-ended questions as opposed to yes, no, or multiple choice, so that you can create a narrative that you are meeting these people where they are, as opposed to where you think they should be or what you think they should know. You would be remiss, and even from a capitalistic sense, you're missing out on this whole market. Some of the work that a lot of the work that I do at High Ivy Health is to open up with questions like, just tell me about your history with pelvic health. Can you talk to your friends? Where do you get your information? Where do you get your health information? All of those questions can just open those doors and help you to diversify the audience that you're talking to and create messaging based on. And also, you'll just have just so much content to be able to put out there if you just take the time to invest in these conversations.
And I think you also find better ways to help people. There might be things that you haven't even thought about. There might be problems that you haven't even seen yet. So sticking with problems that we haven't even seen yet, tell us about the pitfalls of the 10-minute femtech pitch.
Okay. We've seen all of these like awful statistics that what's 2% of VC funding go to female founders, period. And then if you look at an industry where I think it's something like 70 to 80% of the founders in the industry are female, it's almost it can seem like an unsurmountable challenge. I would say also when you are thinking about the different solutions that are being promoted here and the different issues that are being addressed, it's almost like femtech founders are being put into this model where most of the solutions would already be known. The problem would already be known, like erectile dysfunction or something like AI, which is like super buzzy word right now, or a software or fintech or anything like that. When it comes to women's issues, because of stigma, because of taboo, because of a whole range of issues that we've talked about before, about like patriarchy, these issues aren't necessarily new, but they're just not talked about. So, as I think, especially an emerging femtech founder, to have a 10-minute pitch to be able to say, to educate your audience about what, for example, what menstruation is, what endometriosis is, for example, which you could spend a good 5 minutes just talking about the statistics of like how 1 in 10 people are affected. It affects their daily life. It not just that, but it's also productivity, blah, blah, blah. But then you've only got 5 more minutes to talk about your business model, your solution, why it's going to work, why it's going to fit in the market. And I've seen this at so many events where, it's almost like a catch 22 where you'll see a founder go up and just pitch business model, just basically be able to give a really great pitch for how their company is going to be successful. But then the questions from the investors are, this can't be that big of a market. This can't actually be that big of an issue. I don't know anybody that's talking about menopause affecting them in the workplace. And then on the flip side of that, you see someone who really super focuses on the story, has a personal anecdote, has gone through what they're trying to serve, and then talks about their company. And then the investors are like, I haven't seen your business model proved out. I don't. So it can be so frustrating where it's just, I don't know necessarily what the solution is. Is it that maybe different femtech events, you should be able to hand out an educational material before your pitch and just have it focused beyond that? I think that right now that might be necessary because we can't keep disadvantaging these femtech founders by having the responsibility to educate these primary modes of funding on what the issue is and be able to prove out their business model. So I have seen that getting somewhat better. And I think that's, again, why this banner of femtech really helps. But a 10-minute pitch for a company that's looking at a solution that affects like millions of people around the world, you'd be shocked how often I've heard, no, there's no money to be made here.
I'm with you in that one. And I often hear, well, is this such a niche market? And I'm thinking, what's up? 52% of the population are female of some sort. Okay. I think 2 points in that from a VC perspective to play devil's advocate. It's who else are you up against? If there's someone who's easy to understand, even if you've got the best pitch in the world and you can explain in 5 minutes and you can talk about your business model in 5 minutes, which, as you said, in and of itself is already very difficult. I think it's also about who is in the room, and it's conscious bias, unconscious bias. I think it's also part of the solution is having more female VCs, having more both diversity in the VC space, so on the investor space. Again, how do you get that? That's a different conversation. But also, I've seen some female-only VCs, so they're VCs founded by females. A lot of the LPs, i.e. the ultimate investors, are actually females. It tends to be exit of founders, etc. And their niche, among other things, and obviously they have their selection criteria, etc. But their niche is we only invest in female founders because they're so underserved, because there's so many hidden gems in there. And I think actually, I wouldn't even say seeing that as a distinct asset class. I wouldn't even go as far as that. But I think there's definitely some thought that needs to go into that. The other thing, and again, this might seem somewhat controversial, but the other thing I've heard a couple of times now is that, and again, I'm overgeneralizing here, male founders tend to focus on the money. Again, they have their passion, they have whatever it is, but is this business going to make me money? Can I have a big exit from this? Can I live off this? And women tend to come more from a let me save the world perspective. And I think this is just as great, but if your business isn't making money, unless you want to go down the charity route, if your business isn't making money, it's not going to survive long enough to actually save the world. And I think that's super, super important not to forget that. Let's actually have a chat about Ivy, about your business. Tell us about that.
Yeah, can I quickly just go back to your point? Sorry, I just wanna, I understand that and wanna, push back on it just a little bit, because for those VC, companies that just invest in women, that's not a charity case for them. I think the recent McKinsey report said that every dollar invested into a female-founded company and run company, you get $3 back compared to, I think, 175. Don't but not as much for male founders. And also, I think for female founders that are talking about, I want to help people, they are actually producing a financial case because of the sheer amount of women that are able to access these things. And women actually make 80% of all healthcare decisions for their household. So it's almost as though I think, I don't know what I think that mentality is out there, Judith. I'm not saying that's not true, but it's almost like we look at, because a certain uh, demographic of people are underserved or not as successful, we look at encouraging their success as some sort of charity case. And that is the way that I think a lot of people go about it. And then also, I think one of the big issues when it comes to female founders is that they're being over mentored. They're not being given as much money as they should. They aren't being given that money right off the bat. And I think I have seen and heard a lot of people, their mentorship has been like really focus on the story, really, really focus on how you're going to help people. I have heard like one investor say to someone being like, I don't think you're in love with the story. And this was a founder who was creating something for that they went through. So I think that's true, but I do think that women founders and female founders are being ushered into this idea of create a really great story as opposed to, again, like the money. And I think it really depends what industry you're in, but I think that almost like female founders are being told to do that as though the financial case doesn't exist.
That's a good point, actually. That I wasn't aware of so much. I think my point was more around not saying be less idealistic. You need to be idealistic as a founder, but don't forget about the money side, because the money is the lifeblood of the business.
Yes.
And I think that's really the point of it is there. And also coming back to the point that you made of the 3x versus 1.75x return. I'm completely with you on that one. That's why I'm saying that's why there's a growing number of VCs. Again, most of them tend to be female, but there's a growing number of VCs who only invest, whose USP towards their ultimate investors, whose money they're investing essentially, is we focus on female founders because they are the hidden gems, precisely because of the statistic you gave, and also because they're underserved. We have a lot less competition from other investors, because what you have to remember from a founder's point of view, yes, obviously most people are struggling to find financing, especially in this kind of climate. But the really great ones, for some of them, it's the opposite. You've got a lot of term sheets that are coming on your desk and you get to pick. And obviously, as an investor, these are the companies you want to invest in. These are the companies you want to find. But then you also want to be accepted as an investor, right? So if you have, it's that give and take really. But I think my point to the investors, so to the founders really was, do not forget about cash flow. Do not forget about the money side.
I think that's totally right. And Brittany Barretto, like she's got a book coming out that's talking about it, where it's even just like the women's health market, it's a $1 trillion opportunity. And again, it will make everyone healthier. It will, as a social enterprise, actually help the world, but there is a lot of money on the table. And I think, Judith, like you said, it's very important to underscore to VCs and investors, don't leave money on the table just because you think this might be some sort of social cause. But I also think you should invest on social cause. But that's a conversation for the other day. But yeah, about High Ivy Health. So to be clear, it's not my baby, High Ivy Health, although I am quite invested in it. High Ivy was founded, I think, 5 years ago now by our CEO and founder, Rachel Bartholomew, who is actually the director of FemTech Canada as well. She's quite invested in like leveraging all the tools in her toolbox to help other female founders and other femtech founders rise as well. The company itself came from her experience with cervical cancer. So, for those who don't know cervical cancer, one of the treatments for it is radiation in the pelvic area, which essentially can lead to radiation induced vaginal stenosis. So, that is where the vaginal canal starts to narrow and tighten. The current standard of care for that was she was handed this, I don't know, it's basically like it looks like a candle, and was told, handed in a bag by the nurse with some water-based lubricant to be like, "You have to use this for the rest of your life. Good luck." Which I think there are a lot of stories like that when we think about women's health, specifically when it comes to after any sort of treatments. But one thing that was amazing, I think, about Rachel is that she took that personal experience and as an entrepreneur, really just asked as many questions as possible. And what she found was that different conditions like endometriosis, vaginismus, menopause, other cancer treatments, all it's almost there's 36 conditions that we've actually seen. All are related to pelvic pain, which is either from a narrowing or a tightening or a pelvic floor dysfunction that makes your pelvic floor tighten. So we've all heard of Kegels. I do not know what publicist was assigned to Kegels in the 90s. They got it into Sex and the City. It's like ubiquitous. You can talk about doing your Kegel exercises. And for a lot of folks who are on the other side of that pelvic floor dichotomy, so for us, it would be hypertonic, so that those tight muscles, and the other side would be hypotonic, which is those looser muscles. The Kegel market somehow, I think almost because it was direct to consumer. And again, I mentioned somebody was put on that PR campaign a while ago where the idea is to tighten up those muscles. There's different devices, there's different apps. But if you think about your pelvic floor like any other muscle groups, and let's say you have an issue with your neck that the muscles are constantly spasming and are super tight and you can't move them, would you massage them out? Would you use different exercises to ensure that you're lengthening those muscles, or would you get them really super tight? So that's the analogy I like to use. So no, you would lengthen them out, and it's exactly the same for the pelvic floor. And the current standard of care is also something called dilator sets, which a lot of folks like generally use. It's in combination with a lot of folks go to pelvic floor physiotherapy, which is also quite expensive. But you're basically told insert these different size Russian doll. They look quite phallic to me. And I don't know if most folks know this, but the inside of the vagina is actually not shaped like the outside of a penis. More of it depends where you are in your cycle and arousal and all of that, but it's more like a diamond shape than anything. So Rachel took this to some of the people that she knew, specifically a lot of the engineering that's done in Canada is around the Waterloo region. So we leveraged quite a bit of that to create a medical device that actually does dilation without reinsertion. And it's actually using air in these two centralized points to help actually loosen up those muscles. We're also using heat therapy. And when I say this, we're going through our first clinical trials. We aren't on the market yet. And then a sensor to detect things like voluntary and involuntary spasms. So one of the cruxes when I joined the company and I first dove into FemTech, I met Rachel just on a virtual call, and I was so attracted to the mission of the company. And I saw her really grapple with the idea of going direct to consumer versus being a medical device. And despite a lot of pushback, she really wanted to ensure that we were putting something on the market that wasn't going to be costly, that wasn't going to sit in a drawer, and was going to be clinically verified. So she looked at the problem really holistically. And we're going through like I said, the clinical trials, but also we looked at the clinicians who treat pelvic pain. And outside of these dilator sets, there's no standardized set on the pelvic floor. There's only self-reported pain. And again, a lot of pain does go ignored by different clinicians, but we saw all of these clinicians wanting better tools. So we actually are developing a software for the clinicians as well as a patient so that we can collect both objective and subjective data on the pelvic floor.
We have a very special guest. I'm recording at a specific location at the moment, which I do every once in a while. And I think for those who've only got the audio, we've basically just had a catwalk in front of the camera, which does happen every once in a while. He's our FemTech Biohacking Eve mascot.
Yes, mine's asleep. I gave him a little bit of cat before this because he likes to interrupt.
Oh, good stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the book club, basically, because I'm going to have you on a roughly quarterly basis, and you're going to tell us, you're going to tell us about the stuff you've basically learned in the last couple of books you've been discussing. So tell us about how the book club works, what you're trying to achieve with it, and basically what you're going to tell us on.
Oh, there's this book that's related to this topic, or this book, or I want to read that book. I have to say it was a bit of a selfish impetus to start it because I was like, I will be held accountable for reading all of these books that I say that I want to read, because there's always a reason I can lose that time. But I was like, I really do want to educate myself. And it came from a place where we wanted to be able to read these books and get an outside perspective and create some sort of community. So one thing that we've always done for the book club, like I mentioned, we understand that people don't always have time to read the book in its entirety. So we always offer a book overview as well as our key takeaways right off the top of the chat to say, here are the highlights from the book that we took away. And I would say without fail, I walk away with more knowledge than I did before because of the different perspectives that come into it. It's usually a very intimate crowd, which I really enjoy because everyone has the opportunity to bring their own perspective. And we generally choose books that are either we generally look at books that are more science-backed or history. We definitely don't do fiction. And we try to pick and vary the topic every month.
Good stuff. So Susan, look forward to having you on for the first episode of that.
Thank you for having me, Judith.
Thank you for joining me on this transformative journey. Your presence in this community is truly valued. Now, you may not realize it, but your words hold immense power. They have the ability to reach others who may benefit greatly from the wisdom shared here. If you found value in what you heard, I kindly ask you to take a moment to subscribe to Biohacking Eve, leave a glowing review on your preferred podcast platform, and share Biohacking Eve with your friends and family. Your support helps spread the message of health optimization for women far and wide. Lastly, I want to express my gratitude to you for investing in yourself. By prioritizing your well-being, you serve as an inspiration to others. I'm eagerly looking forward to bringing you many more exciting episodes, and thank you for being a vital part of our community. Live long and prosper, my friend. The Biohacking Eve Health Optimization for Women podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice, and no doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be substituted for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of the healthcare professionals for any such conditions. In addition, the information on this podcast does not constitute investment or financial advice.